My name's Dr Nicola Canale. I'm an educational psychologist. I work as part of a parenting team, supporting parents of children in the early years as part of Cardiff Early Help. I'm also a mum of two young, lively, spirited boys, so everything I talk about today is being sort of tried and tested at home as well. Today I'm going to be talking about children's behaviour in the early years, how we can perhaps understand those behaviours in a bit more detail and how we can respond to those behaviours. In the early years, it's really common for children to get overwhelmed by big emotions. Their brains are still developing, their nervous systems are still developing, so we see lots of behaviours that we as parents can find tricky to manage sometimes, such as hitting, throwing, biting, shouting, refusing to follow instructions. So if we give a child a blue plate when they were expecting a yellow plate, you can see some of these big emotions spilling over and some of these behaviours. And I think parenting children in the early years is a difficult job and it can be quite tricky and quite stressful at times. Children's behaviour is very linked to their stage of development. We know that the brain is developing very rapidly in the early years, and that some of the behaviours that children, particularly young children, display is sort of outside of their control. So these big emotions can really take over, and I think one of the traps we can fall into as parents is thinking that some of these behaviours are sort of manipulative or they're acting out in a way to get their own way before they're actually capable of doing that. And I think one of our jobs as parents, as adults, is to actually help children to develop these skills so they can have a little bit more control over these behaviours, but that takes a long time and that's still really developing in the early years. Like any other skill that we help children develop in the early years, like reading or riding a bike, we're also trying to help them develop what we call self-regulation skills. So this is that skill to be able to perhaps control and manage some of those big emotions and some of those behaviours. But that takes time and it's dependent on quite a few factors really. You have the child's temperament, so some children are more easygoing and laid back, and other children can be a bit more sensitive or spirited. So that plays a big role. But one of the biggest environmental factors that plays a role in developing children's self-regulation skills is their interactions with their parents or their caregivers or other adults. Really, we need to think about ways when we're faced with these big behaviours, these big emotions, we need to think of ways of responding to those in ways that not only help us with those behaviours, but also help the children to develop these self-regulation skills. And of course, the other way that children learn self-regulation skills is by watching and observing the adults around them, and we call this modelling. We can explain the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown thinking about Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. So if we think about a tantrum, where a child is perhaps demanding something or whining or repeating something over and over again, we know that for older children, they can be throwing what's known as an upstairs brain tantrum. And this is where the thinking part of the brain is still integrated with the emotional part of the brain, and they are just acting out in a way to have maybe what they want. We know this is usually an upstairs brain tantrum because if we give them what they want, that behaviour stops quite quickly. Now for younger children, particularly very young children, they're not really capable of throwing these types of tantrums or upstairs brain tantrums because we know their brain isn't well developed enough to be able to do that. With younger children, what they're usually having is what we call a downstairs brain tantrum or a meltdown, where the thinking part of the brain has disconnected from the emotional brain, so they have flipped their lids and they are very overwhelmed by these big feelings. So they're in something that we sometimes call as emotional flood. And I think, again, part of our role is to help calm them, bring them back to a state of calm before we can actually respond to that behaviour. How we respond to children's behaviours can really illuminate this difference between punishment and discipline. If we're using punishment to try and change behaviours, we might be able to achieve that through fear or shame, and it would give us perhaps a quick fix with regards to changing children's behaviours, but they might not lead to any sort of longer lasting changes. They wouldn't really help support children's social, emotional and behaviour development, and they could actually impact negatively on children's self-esteem. If we're using discipline, and we think about the word discipline comes from the Latin to teach, it can be a longer process. It can take lots of practice to help children develop these positive behaviours, but it will lead to those longer lasting changes, and also at the same time it will help develop children's social, emotional and behavioural development, and it will also increase their self-esteem, which is a win-win situation for parents and children. Kim Goldin has developed an approach to parenting that she calls the 2 hands of parenting. So she talks about the 2 hands of parenting, and what she talks about is this one hand provides the connection. So this is the warmth, the interaction, the loving interactions between children and their caregivers, and the other hand is the correction. This is the hand that provides the boundaries, the routines, the structure that young children also need. Kim Goldin has devised 7 steps to connection with correction, and in my work with parents we've adapted this to call it the 7 C's of responding to behaviours. So the first step is just to clock it, just to notice what's happening. Do you need to step in to make the environment safe, or is it just some low-level behaviour that you can just distract or ignore? So step 2 is really important, is to calm yourself, to check whether your lid's flipped or whether you are feeling regulated and able to respond to what's happening in front of you. You might need to take 5 deep breaths. If there is someone else in the house, you might need to call on them for support. But it's about calming yourself first so that you're able to respond to the situation instead of react. So the third C is to calm your child. Is your child drowning in an emotional flood? Have they flipped their lids? And do they need your help to calm? Every child is different, every child is unique, so you will know as a parent what helps them calm. Some children like a touch or a hug, other children need a little bit of space and you sitting nearby to help them calm. The 4th C, I think, is one of the most important things we can do as parents or adults when we're trying to help children with their behaviours. The 4th C is curiosity. If we can be curious about some of the underlying reasons as to why our child is behaving in this way, it gives us lots of clues as to how to prevent those things happening again in the future, but also how to manage and respond to that behaviour in that given time. So one of the things we think about is us as parents being like deep sea divers. So if we've got an iceberg with some of those challenging behaviours on the tip of the iceberg, like shouting or screaming or hitting out, we need to go under the water there and have a look at some of those emotions and needs that are driving those behaviours. So a really helpful acronym to think about with children in the early years is HALT. So HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely or tired. Is there any of those needs that need to be met, or is that contributing to some of those behaviours? It can be really helpful in ways to respond to those behaviours. So the 5th C is connect. So even if we are very good at being curious about the underlying causes to those behaviours or those unmet needs, we sometimes forget to actually tell the child that or say that out loud. So if we think a child is tired, we can say, I can see you're tired now, therefore maybe we should put these away and go and have a rest. Or I can see you're really sad because I've said no more biscuits, we'll have another one tomorrow. So it's really saying out loud, connecting that emotion to the child's behaviour, and this really helps children to develop Their social, emotional development also helps them to self-regulate in the future. So the sixth C is correction. So this is where that second hand of parenting comes in. Do we need to provide at this point, when we've calmed ourselves, calmed our child, do we need to provide an age appropriate consequence? So for example, you hurt your brother with the toy is going away, or you put your wellies on or no park, the choice is yours. So children still need those boundaries and those age appropriate consequences at times. The seventh C is to connect again. So you bring back that other hand of parenting, the connection. Once you've put that consequence in and you've stuck to that, you then reconnect with your child, maybe through a cuddle or reading a story together, but you don't keep going back to that behaviour and what happened. You be like Elsa and let it go.